a bit recent. It's not very historical, but I would say Volodymyr Zelensky, because my mom's side of the family is Ukrainian. Her father immigrated from Ukraine. Her mother grew up in a Ukrainian community in northern Manitoba. So I follow the details of the war every day through the news and through podcasts. So that would be somebody I would love to sit and talk with.
Nice. Okay, so he's a busy guy, but I guess, no restrictions on that question. That's a good answer.
Right.
That's a good answer. And as somebody who lives in Toronto, we both are based in Toronto. Tell
Right.
me your least favorite part. Toronto's a great city, but what gets on your nerves about Toronto?
Oh man, this was easy for me. This was super easy. So number one, motorcycle noise in the summertime. Just like really, really loud motorcycles where they take off whatever that is that muffles the sound. And the second thing would be secondhand smoke.
Okay.
Just what? Well, I had an incident a few years ago. My daughter was in a daycare, and there was like people allowed to smoke nearby. So I started this whole like campaign. I got like city councilors to write letters and stuff to prevent the smokers from getting close to the daycare playground. So the idea of like secondhand smoke and stuff, it's just I grew up in the country, so I was never exposed to secondhand smoke until I came into the city, and now I realize it's a lot of people smoke. So
Fair enough. I actually didn't know that's the first time I've heard that. And maybe it's not Toronto specific. Maybe
like
it's a Tim
right,
specific gripe about a big
totally,
city, but
it's not Toronto. Yeah.
I'll try to keep my positive impression of Toronto intact. Um, okay. And last rapid question here. If you could live anywhere for a year, where would it be and why?
So I thought about an island in the Mediterranean. So Mallorca, Corsica, Sardinia, someplace warm, close to the ocean. I think that would be amazing.
Nice. Well, okay, we're getting into fall and winter time here, so I can see why you would say that.
Or I'd be dreaming of the Mediterranean for sure.
Nice. Okay. So, fun part aside, can you tell us a bit about your professional journey that's led you to the place that you're at today, and why you were motivated to develop and share your philosophy of leadership?
Yeah. So first off, thanks again, Michael, for the chance to be here. I really do appreciate it. I'm flattered that you invited me. So my professional journey, when I was a kid, my father was a consultant and a serial entrepreneur who participated in a number of different consulting partnerships over the years. And he finished his PhD in Chicago in the early '60s, and then came back to Toronto, taught briefly at a university here, realized he didn't like that, and then promptly moved over into the consulting world. He started with just doing basic survey work, survey research for companies, and then that over the years kind of migrated into the leadership development space. And that included assessment and coaching, which at that time was like this nascent, but somewhat burgeoning industry. So he was a really big personality. He loved to talk and tell stories, and he would often sit around the dinner table and he would talk about the clients he was working with, the challenges they were facing. And so his energy and his stories and his love of his work probably seeded in me an interest in the field. And then eventually, in terms of my school, I started studying psychology eventually and realized that I enjoyed that. I realized eventually I could combine that interest in psychology with an interest in leadership, and eventually that led me to think about doing a PhD. And really the main reason I pursued a PhD was because I was motivated to study leadership in a deeper and more intensive way. So as I reached the end of my school career, the end of my graduate school career, my father, he was in his early 80s at that point. He had tried to sell his business a few times. It hadn't quite worked out. So he reached out to me and he said, if you are interested in maybe working together, there might be an opportunity for us to partner up when you're finished school. So I tried to finish my program a little bit early. I came to work with him. He was still involved in leadership development at that time. So it was a nice continuity between my educational training and then my professional phase of my life. I got to still focus on leadership, and yeah, we worked together for a few years, and then I took over the business from him. And as I always joke with people, I've been trying not to screw it up since that point. So, and the part of your question that talks about leadership philosophy, I wanted to write about my leadership philosophy because basically two reasons. Number one, I have been working in leadership development space for such a long period of time that I had accumulated some ideas that I felt like I just wanted to express and to share. And there's not always a simple or straightforward way to share those with clients in the context of a leadership program. Especially in coaching, you're usually in a listening posture and you're mostly letting the client kind of lead the way. But I had been, kind of percolating on all these ideas, and I wanted to share some of them and kind of give them a place to exist out in the real world. And the other thought that I had was I felt like some of my leadership ideas were a little differentiated from what I typically saw in sort of short content marketing pieces on leadership that you would often see on the internet. So those short pieces I think are great, and they're very practical often, and they're easy to read, easy to digest. But I had been thinking about leadership in pretty deep and nuanced ways for a long time, and part of me wanted to encourage other people to think about it in the same way. So I kind of coached myself and I said, okay, if you think you have valuable ideas, Tim, like it's up to you to put them out there and write them up and share them with people. So I decided to start a newsletter and share some of those concepts.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Um, I think as we were talking initially in preparation, I think one thing that sort of drew me into some of the work you were doing was that desire to challenge yourself, challenge um, your own perspective in relation to what you were seeing out there, and in particular, put the promise of organizational psychologists and what we claim to bring to the table a little bit to the test. So I'm just, yeah, I thought that was something that really drew me into your approach.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
So okay, so I'm gonna start you with a broad question here. So
Yeah.
tell me, what is a great leader?
Okay, so it's a great question. I really appreciate you asking it, and there's so many different ways to answer it. And I think depending on the paradigm that you kind of come from or the perspective that you come from, you might answer it in different ways, right? So if depending on your perspective, you might say a great leader is somebody who is inspiring. You might say it's someone who is adaptable to the situation. You might say it's somebody who combines task and people-oriented behaviors. You might say it's somebody who builds culture. It's somebody who sets stretch goals, who has emotional intelligence. Like on and on and on, we could go. So I think there's a sense with leadership that there's many paths to the summit, and there's or another phrase that I think of is like 1,000 flowers can bloom. So there's many ways to be great. There's many ways to be effective. I think from a minimalist perspective, like the minimum ingredients you need to be a leader are, as far as I can see, a couple of things. You need to have a goal that is discrepant from the status quo. And secondly, you need to be able to move people in the direction of that goal. And beyond that, beyond those two minimal ingredients, I think there's just a ton of variability. So I can't give you obviously like a straight answer because it's a very complex question, but I can tell you a few things about what I think in terms of what I believe great leadership involves and what I think it also doesn't involve. And so maybe that will help kind of clarify through a bit of a compare and contrast. So I think great leadership involves inspiration. I think great leaders motivate people. They create energy in other people. I think great leadership is active and involved. So great leaders, they don't just direct, but they roll up their sleeves and they get involved. They facilitate the accomplishment of the goal. They remove roadblocks, that kind of thing. I think great leadership is relational. So I sort of see great relationships as the connective tissue that helps leaders move a social unit towards a goal, and also keeps that social cohesion intact as the leaders continue to kind of stress that group and push them to do a bit more and a bit more and a bit more. I think great leaders also adjust to the situation, right? So they scan the environment, they understand the context, and they kind of listen for the whispers in the environment that might suggest, okay, what does this team or group need right now? Or what does the situation suggest about what the most effective or most optimal style of leadership might be in this moment? And then lastly, I'll say I think great leaders are visionary in the sense that they have a goal. And I was just alluding to this a moment ago, right? They have a goal and they try to convince others of the worthiness of that goal. Things that I think great leadership isn't. So I think great leadership is not hostile, cold, demeaning, dehumanizing, manipulative. I think great leadership is also not passive, avoidant, or laissez-faire. I think great leadership is not asocial. Like, it's hard to be a loner, to be a leader. I think leadership is inherently an interpersonal task. I think that's the core function or core task of leadership, is to be able to connect with people. I think leadership is not self-protective. It's not selfish, right? It's more sacrificial. It's more self-sacrificing yourself in the interest of the broader group or the collective. I also think it's not rigid, and it's not overly negative. Like, I think great leadership, in most cases, is very positive. It's uplifting, and like I said before, it creates energy, doesn't detract from energy. So those are just some thoughts that come to mind. But I appreciate the question, and it's fun to kind of speculate.
Yeah, well, I think what I appreciate about your answer, and I think what's so important, is to keep the idea central that you laid out, which is leadership at its core is about knowing where you're going and getting people to that place, right? And so you mentioned themes around vision, you mentioned themes around relationships, and that's just almost like definitional leadership behavior. But then great leadership, right, is awareness, it's positive energy, it's, yes, you can get people to your goal, but what became of those people along the way, right? And so
Right.
being effective as a leader, okay, you got to your goal. Being great as a leader, right, means you brought everybody there, and they don't hate you, and they don't hate your
Yes.
company, and they don't hate the experience.
Totally. And I think what you're getting at is like a distinction between compliance and internal intrinsic motivation. And you were going to ask a question about how leadership, I think you were going to ask a question about how leadership may have changed, or at least something we talked about in advance of the session. And that was something I was thinking about for that question, is that I think leaders now care a lot more about not just getting people to not just getting people to do what they want them to do, but getting people to want to do what the leader wants them to do, if that makes sense, right? Like, generating that internal motivation and energy within other people, not just settling for mere compliance, but really trying to generate a stronger source of motivation in other people. That's a great point.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it reminds me of like every day on LinkedIn, somebody posts the differences between leaders and managers, right? And it's
Yeah.
it's like exactly what you're talking about, right? It's like, oh, managers are compliance and leaders are, you know, positive focused and all of that. So I think whatever branding you want to use, I think really what we're talking about is, when we talk about leadership, is exactly what you're talking about. And so to your point, my next question was going to be, and I'll ask it: does great leadership look different today? And today being post-pandemic and all, remote work, all but everything that we're going through today, does it look
Yeah.
different today than it did 5 years ago, 50 years ago? And in light of any changes that you can think of, how has the way that we support leaders changed as well?
Yeah, and thanks for this question too. I thought it was really fun to just to try to capture my thoughts on this and think this through. So for the first part of the question, I'm going to focus on, if it's okay, a 10-year time horizon rather than a 5-year, just
Sure,
because
sure.
I've
That
had
that that was arbitrary. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
okay. So I've had a number of clients that have said to me, like, in the last 10 years, I've really noticed these changes. So I'll just comment on what I've heard through those conversations. So I think in the last 10 years, I think the standards for interpersonal effectiveness for leaders has increased quite considerably. So I think people's expectations about how they want to be treated, how they want to be interacted with in an interpersonal sense, have shifted. And I think the standards of etiquette for leaders are higher. I think the costs of making mistakes in that area, the costs of incivility, of rude behavior, discourteous behavior, disrespectful behavior, I think those are higher. And I know that through conversations I've had with leaders at various moments, that some of them struggle with this and feel some frustration around trying to adapt to this. But I also see it as a bit of a signal that as a society, we're trying to move in a direction where we show more dignity to one another as people, both at work and beyond. And so, I see it as a struggle that's worthwhile. The second trend I've noticed in the last 10 years is that I think people expect senior executives to more and more articulate a purpose for the organization that's aligned with the broader good or the broader society. So having like working for a purpose-driven organization, working for an organization where you feel like they're acknowledging the dignity of other people and of their employees, where they're valuing diversity and plurality, where, as I said, they're focused on contributing to the common good, not just shareholder return. I think those things seem to be much more important to people now than they did even 10 years ago. Um, okay, so 50 years. I think a lot has changed in the 50-year time horizon. I wasn't alive 50 years ago, but from what I've read, these are some of what I'm about to say. Kind of represents, I think, some reasonable guesses. So back in the 1950s and 60s, there were only two dimensions, behavioral dimensions, that people thought about when they thought about leadership, and that was task-oriented behaviors and people-oriented behaviors. At that time, too, I think most people thought that characteristics or dispositions were the things that drove or predicted leadership behavior. So things like personality, like the need for power was a personality trait that got a lot of attention, like back in the 60s. Intelligence would be another example. So traits and characteristics that don't change that much. Also, back in the 1960s, the idea that leaders should adapt themselves to different situations, that was only starting to show up on the radar screen. That was only starting to rear its head as a possibly valuable idea in leadership discourse. Now, I think things are very different. So we've blown past this simple dichotomy of task versus people leadership, and there's lots of other behavioral dimensions that we think about now that could be relevant to leadership, like self-awareness, emotional intelligence, fairness, reward and reinforcement, and on and on and on. Inspirational behavior is another one. I would also say that that comment I made about leaders striving to generate intrinsic motivation in people rather than just compliance. Like, I think that is much more prominent now. Like, leaders want other people to want to do the things that they are interested in accomplishing, and they're trying to generate almost like a higher level of motivation or a stronger form of it, rather than just getting people to sort of comply and move along towards the goal. So the idea of generating motivation, I think, is more prominent. I think we now think that leadership is not just driven by traits, but it's driven by behaviors. And probably as a result of that, we think that leadership can be developed and trained a little bit. And leaders are not just born, but they can also be made and kind of shaped over time. I think that interpersonal effectiveness, as I mentioned, is a lot more on the forefront. It's more important to people. I think we care a lot about how leaders make us feel now compared to maybe 50 years ago. And then a couple other last things. I think authenticity is a concept that resonates with people now in the leadership space much more than it ever would have back then. And then finally, although I know there's lots of examples of bad leaders throughout the course of history, leaders who committed crimes or perpetrated wars. But I think in the last 20 years or so, we've mapped out some terrain related to the dark side of leadership, related to destructive forms of leadership, personality traits that measure some of these maladaptive behavior patterns. And so I think that whole side of things is much more articulated now than it used to be. And now we kind of realize that leaders don't just do great things, but if they kind of go off the tracks a bit, they can cause some problems and do some damage as well. And we need to be mindful of the upside and the downside.
Yeah.
I,
Well,
and I can
just
speak to your, yeah, go ahead.
no, just a comment, because
Mhm.
I mean, it reminds me, I was reading a book a while ago about Gordon Allport, and
Yeah.
sort of in the 1920s, 1930s, a lot of the language has shifted, and he was responsible for a lot of it. But some language that we don't use nowadays to describe great leadership that they would have felt very comfortable using were things like character and strength and virtue and sort of very moralistic internal qualities that leaders just have, right? And never mind sort of the social context of, okay, so we sort of reinforce the picture of what leadership looks like, and you either are or you aren't. And then the shift to more sort of less moralistic, more descriptive and situational focused personality traits and things like that, and started to talk about how people interact with their environment and interact with others, and that shift to the value of people's humanity is almost sort of charted through some of the language that's really common in the discourse.
Yes, that's very interesting. Yeah, the focus on morality and characteristics and leader is like who you are is a leader, and that's just something that doesn't change. Versus, you can shift your behavior across different situations. You can change it depending on the situation, and you can choose or not choose to exhibit certain kinds of leadership behaviors. Yeah, that's an interesting kind of trajectory of thinking and evolution.
Yeah, yeah. No, I also wonder because certainly the positioning of leadership as a trainable set of qualities and skills and behaviors reinforces, the benefit of getting support. And before it's like, well, you either are or you aren't. And if you're, a born leader and you're doing it wrong, like who am I to say? It's really changed changed the dynamic of the world around leadership also.
Definitely. No, I think that's a sensible change too, because I think there's good evidence that you can train leaders. There's lots of evidence now that leadership development programs have considerable impact on learning, on various training criteria. I was just reading a piece about that a couple months ago. So no, there's good evidence for that now, and I'm glad that perspective has changed.
Yeah, no, me too. It's a nicer world, it feels like. I mean, listen, in some ways it's not, it's hard to feel like we're not better off now in a lot of ways. Okay, so to take a quick pause, and to those of you who are with us, again, if you have any questions, I see a couple in the chat, and so I'm going to pose one to Tim, but I'd love to hear from you, as you think about some of the changes that you've seen in leadership, whether in your organizations or in the leaders that you work with or the things that you've read. When you think about some of the trends that we're experiencing, you start looking forward. I'd love to hear what's top of mind for you. So if you want to, just drop some of that into the chat, I'd love to hear it. And I know Tim would as well. And I have a question from Mark Hurwitz. And so Tim, he asks, how do you differentiate between great leadership and great followership? Most of the attributes you mentioned of great leaders, I guess earlier on, could apply to anyone, whether as a leader or a follower.
Yeah, to be honest, Mark, and first of all, hi. I haven't seen you in a few years, but I hope you're doing well. Yeah, to be honest, that is one area that is a bit of a gap in my knowledge, is the followership literature. So I know that you're more expert on that than I am, and I probably should explore that as I continue to write out my leadership philosophy. But yeah, I think what your question kind of gets at a general trend that I've noticed in my reading about leadership that suggests that a new and emerging paradigm, or maybe it's not new anymore, but it's certainly another paradigm of leadership is this idea of like moving towards thinking about leadership as a shared activity amongst lots of people. There's one theory that I came across called relational leadership theory, which I think kind of advocates this. And the basic premise is like, leadership emerges through the shared relationship and bonds that are forged between the people that are working together in a team, and the sort of the quality of that relationship produces all the stuff that leadership would normally produce, if I'm capturing it right. But I think one implication of that kind of theory is that like leadership can it can be a top-down thing. It can be an inspirational, bold leaders standing on a soapbox, but it can also be a shared activity that is common to across a lot of group members. And different people can step forward at different times, at different moments with different skill sets, and they can take charge, and people can kind of fall in behind them and choose to follow them. So I think your point is well taken, that some of these characteristics could also be shared by great followers, and leadership can kind of move around within groups depending on who might have the energy or the skill to deal with a certain task.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I will comment. Mark says, doing well, thanks. So I know I'm monitoring the chat. Tim's not, so I'm relaying your messages to him. Um,
Thanks.
but yeah, thank you for answering that. And I know, as Tim mentioned, Mark is pretty deep on the followership side. So if that's a topic that's interesting to you, definitely connect with Mark and explore that with him further. Um, okay, okay. So we're on a tight schedule, so we're gonna keep it moving along. Um, Next question. So let's get into your leadership framework that you've been referencing and that you've been working on. So can you share a little bit about some of the key principles that you think would be important for the audience to hear about?
Sure. So just to orient people, so the framework is basically set up as a 2 by 2 matrix. So you can imagine a 2 by 2 grid. On the above the horizontal line are drivers of effective leadership. Below the horizontal line are derailers of effective leadership. To the left of the center line are principles that I picked up in my academic experiences, and then principles to the right of the center line are those that I picked up in ideas I picked up in practice through consulting. And then there's a section in the middle of the grid which contains principles that don't necessarily have a neat correspondence to any of those other quadrants, but I still feel like they're important. So I'm not sure where their home is, but I want to capture them and just remember them. So I stick them in the middle of the model. So that's how it's organized. In terms of a couple of principles that might be of interest, so I'll start by talking about passive and avoidant leadership. So this is a principle I picked up on in my academic experience, and it's also considered a derailer. So the backstory here is that when I was in grad school, I was doing a project where I was investigating the relationship between leadership and employee commitment. And as part of that project, I had to go around and collect up a bunch of other studies that other people had done, gather those studies together, pull out some data points from those studies, and then input them into my database with the idea that I was going to aggregate or kind of come up with an average relationship or an average estimate of the relationship between leadership and employee commitment. So that was kind of the nature of the project. And the leadership framework I was looking at at the time was one that ran across a spectrum of different behaviors. And on one side of the spectrum was really active, involved, positive leadership. And then on the right-hand side of the spectrum were passive and avoidant leadership behaviors. And there were a number of gradations in between those two polarities. So as I was doing this project, I noticed something really interesting that jumped out at me, which was the more passive and avoidant the leadership style became, the more corrosive an effect it seemed to have on employee commitment. And I even noticed that the magnitude of that corrosive effect was quite surprising. So, for example, an active, constructive, positive form of leadership might predict employee commitment at positive 0.40 or correlation of positive 0.40. That would be a pretty high correlation for psychology. But I also noticed the passive and avoidant leadership sometimes correlated with employee commitment at negative 0.40, which is quite a strong negative correlation for leadership research. So that really caught my eye. Passive and avoidant leadership wasn't really a theme among researchers at that time. And what I really took from that was that maybe the downside risk of passive and avoidant leadership was just as strong as the upside opportunity of really engaged constructive leadership. And if so, that would be interesting. So there was two different kind of key principles that I learned about in that project, and which I still think about today, which have to do with passive leadership, or two types of passive leadership that I think maybe the audience can keep in mind. So number one is it's a bit of a word salad, but it's called management by exception passive. And it basically means that the leader waits until things get as bad as they can possibly be before jumping in to correct them. And when they do jump in, they don't offer any positive reinforcement. They just correct the individual. They say, no, you're doing that wrong. Do this differently. The other form of passive leadership that I think is worth keeping in mind, which is even more corrosive than the last one I mentioned, is called laissez-faire. And this is when leaders are totally unavailable when people need them. So they don't respond to questions, they don't respond to urgent situations, they're not around when people need them. Literally, the roof could be on fire. Everybody's looking around for some guidance, and they can't find the leaders. So this was a trend that I noticed back in this was like 20 years ago. But now there's actually quite a bit of research that's accumulated that suggests passive leadership is really has a really negative impact on people. So now we find that the more passive the leader, the lower trust people have in him or her. The more people are stressed about their roles working under a passive leader, the more they feel fatigued with work, the more incivility they report in the workplace. So the more rude and disrespectful behavior they report. Also, the more passive the leader, the more conflict occurs between coworkers, and the more bullying takes place in the workplace. So just a couple takeaways on this, I would say, is you're either a leader or you're working with leaders. One takeaway might be think about the distinction between active versus passive. So just pretend for a moment that there's only two kinds of leaders in the world. There's active leaders and there's passive leaders. Which team do you want to be on, right? You want to be on the active team. So you want to be available, present, engaged. You want to be there when people need you. And so don't worry about being a hero. Don't worry about being inspirational. Don't worry about being a visionary, about executive presence. Don't worry about anything. Just worry about being active, available, present. When you're needed. The second takeaway I would say is I've seen in my experience sometimes good leaders with good intentions get a bit tarred and feathered for traveling a lot and for working like leading teams in remote situations. So sometimes they can be perceived as more passive than they really are. And so I would just caution, if you're leading a remote team or you're going to be doing that for an extended period, or you're traveling to a considerable degree, just think about some proactive steps you can take to signal your availability to your team, to signal to them that you want to help if it's needed, just so they don't inadvertently attribute you as being passive or avoidant or unavailable.
Yeah, first of all, I love the distinction because it breaks down on clear lines. It also makes it clear that leadership isn't a job where you can say, I didn't do anything wrong. Why is everything going sideways? That's passive, right? Passive leadership creates a vacuum. It creates, lack of trust. It creates expectations. That things that people fill, in often negative ways, and creates stress. It creates all sorts of things. People want, like you said, active leadership. They want presence. And to your point about, well, passive isn't just not being around, but passive is managing by exception. And I think of
Mhm.
words like hovering and micromanagement, and it might feel active, right? But it's an expression of management by exception. It falls under that passive umbrella.
Yeah, that's true. There's actually a version of management by exception that's called active um, in that same framework. And it tends to be a little bit less corrosive or negative in terms of its outcomes than the management by exception passive. Again, sorry for the wordy titles, but you're right. It's still not super positive. It's still not. It's you're not going to win the gold medal as a leader by by just using that particular style. You'll need more skills in your repertoire.
Yeah, yeah, and to your point about sort of the inversely positive benefits of being active, I wanted to
Yep.
bring in a question from Andrew that he shared earlier on, and maybe you can just give me a little bit more on it, which is, what are the ways that leaders can create energy in others and inspire those around them? And I think that's a question that flows into, that sort of active side of leadership, but maybe a couple of examples of, how you can actually build energy through, and inspire people.
Totally. Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say you have to articulate a compelling vision. You have to not only create a goal, but you have to like stoke that goal so it's like dripping with attractiveness, and you need other people to see like, oh my God, this is such an attractive goal. Like, and I can see how great it would be to accomplish it. Like I begin to help people envision like how amazing it would be to accomplish this goal. That's one way. You can also appeal to a sense of duty and obligation. So this isn't just something that we want to do; it's the right thing to do. Right? Like we have an obligation to fulfill to pursue this goal, right? So you can appeal to people through their desire to want to achieve something directly by just creating a really attractive goal, or you can appeal to them through a sense of duty and morality even. Another thing that I like to mention to leaders that I feel like often gets a little bit missed is expressing confidence that you think other people can achieve a goal. So once, as a leader, once you lay down a goal or a challenge, don't just leave it there, but say, you know what, Michael, I believe you can do this. Like I know that you have the talent to do this, and that's a very powerful message. And in my experience, coaching and working with leaders, many people often miss that, just that expression of confidence in the other person. But that can be very, very energizing for sure. I could go on with this, but those are just a few ideas.
Yeah, no, awesome, awesome. And to your point, and I think a theme that you're talking about in the active style of leadership isn't just say the right thing, make it, yes, yeah, make it look attractive, make that goal, align everybody towards it. The active part is keep talking about it, right? Don't just say it once and expect it to be so resonant that people are just going to like tap into that energy, throughout the rest of the year, right? Continue to talk about it, be active, be present with people.
For sure, yeah, and yeah, continue to renew the energy, and be positive about, be positive about the goal, and try to focus on uplifting aspects of pursuing it. Like this is kind of a key challenge. Is like, maybe we'll talk about this later. I've written some notes on it, but this idea, like as a leader, you need to challenge people, right? Like you need to push them into zones of discomfort. But how do you do that and actually make them want to go there? Like you have to all be uncomfortable as a team, and as an organization to accomplish great things, right? But like, how do you convince people, like, no, we need to go into this really uncomfortable space, and do this really hard thing, and it's not going to be easy. But I'm telling you, it's a good idea. Like that's a very tricky skill, and so you have to kind of find ways to create energy and motivation and inspiration, to help people say, yeah, you know what, it's worth the cost, it's worth the discomfort that I might have to go through here, and I want to follow Michael or whoever.
Yeah. No, 100%. 100%. And yeah, a lot of comments in the chat about, your comments about passive appointment leadership and active leadership, but certainly we could talk about that for a lot longer. Did you have,
Uh,
another part of your framework to share?
Sure, I can share one more. It actually
Perfect.
builds on something we were just talking about. But let me just say, I'm glad people found this idea, like passive leadership, kind of interesting and helpful, because yeah, I do think it's a valuable concept just to keep in mind. The second concept I wanted to mention is something from the practice side of the matrix, and it's also a driver, not a derailer, but a driver. And so let me just tell you the backstory on this. So the backstory is it's a dark and stormy night in 2010. It wasn't a night; it was an afternoon. But I was 2010. I was in a corporate office meeting room. I was sitting on one side of the table with my father, and across the other side were two other executives we were meeting with. And at one point in the meeting, my father leans over the table, sticks out his finger, and wags it at one of the other executives and says, "You need to show more edge." And there was this like pause in the meeting, and the executives nodded, seeming to indicate that they understood and accepted this feedback that my father was giving one of them. But on my side of the table, I was sitting there thinking, gosh, just a few years ago, I was finishing my PhD, and in that time, I must have spent hundreds, maybe thousands of hours learning everything I could about leadership, reading about it, writing about it, researching it. And I have no idea what these guys are talking about. And I have no theory or model in my mind that can kind of explain what edge refers to in terms of a leadership skill. So that was 2010. Fast forward to 2018. I started working with another organization, and this term started to pop up all the time. So it appeared in the company's values document. The CEO mentioned it fairly frequently. And people at that company would come to me at the beginning of a leadership program, and they would say things like, Tim, my boss says I need to show more edge, but I'm not sure what that means. So I decided to try to investigate, like, is this actually a valid, valuable leadership skill that I could coach people on or work with people on to develop. So I decided to start interviewing executives. So far, I've interviewed 17 executives from VP to CEO levels. I've analyzed all the data in detail. I'm doing another round of interviews this fall. And so some of these results are kind of tentative and emerging, but I wanted to share them in this forum because this is a concept that really influences my thinking. And I do find that a lot of clients I work with, they either over-index on this or they under-index on it, and very few get it kind of in that just right zone. So I think the key question that this notion of edge seems to address is, like, how can leaders push, pull, nudge, challenge their teams to the absolute limit of performance, right up to the limit, but to do that in a way that also preserves and keeps intact the social relationships and the social fabric that's needed in order to accomplish some of those great objectives. Um, so I the definition of edge that I've come up with so far based on this work I've done is as follows. So it's constructive and adaptive tension used to move people towards a challenging goal. And so there's three different terms there. I'll just specify what I mean. So constructive means pursuing a valuable goal. Like, 95% of the people in this company, we all agree this is a valuable goal. It's also a goal that will strengthen the collective. It's not just a personal agenda, but it'll strengthen the collective. and it's pursued in a way that's professional, respectful, collaborative. So constructive means something about the goal itself, and it means something about how you pursue the goal. Adaptive is the second term, and I think based on my understanding, that refers to the idea that the pushing, the challenge, or the tension actually makes the other person better off or stronger for having been exposed to it, right? It doesn't deplete them, it doesn't diminish them, it doesn't debilitate them. It actually increases their energy and motivation level, right? We were talking about that a moment ago. And tension is the last term, and I'll describe tension in a couple different ways. There's goal tension, and there's interactional tension. Tension at its base, I think, just means creating discomfort. And leaders can create discomfort in a couple different ways through the goal that they set. You know, a big stretch goal has a lot of tension associated with it, a lot of discomfort associated with it. And then in the way that leaders interact with people, they can also apply tension or discomfort. So they can draw people's attention to a standard that needs to be met, right? They can hold people accountable. They can make people focus on the fact that we're over here right now, but we need to get somewhere better in the future. Sorry, I hope you guys can see my hands. So just a couple takeaways on edge, just to kind of wrap up this section. Number one, I think edge is a concept that suggests that leaders need to combine applying some discomfort to the people they work with, but do it in a way that is really relational and really harmony seeking. So I think one thing that I find really interesting about this concept of edge is that it challenges the preconceived notion that leaders need to make other people feel good all the time. And in contrast to that, it kind of suggests that, in order to achieve great things, people have to feel some kind of discomfort, and leaders may need to apply some discomfort to other people, some tension, but they need to find a way to do it in a really constructive, harmonious, relational kind of way. So you need to kind of balance both of those two concepts. The second takeaway and last one I'll mention is about how edge is a process, not an event. So one thing I thought when I started this process or started these interviews was that edge was this like in the moment skill where leaders need to say just the right thing at just the right moment, like Jack Nicholson in a great movie or something. And what I learned is that it's actually a process. So there's some pre-interaction steps that need to be taken and some post-interaction steps that need to be taken. So the pre-interaction stuff might be like establishing your credibility, building strong relationships, um, understanding the context, right? If you're going to push some people or challenge them, you should really understand like what the context and situation is. The post-interaction steps could be things like keeping the goals consistent, repairing relationships. Maybe if you've caused some friction and rubbed people the wrong way, just things like that. So hopefully that's clear. I wanted to share some of that with you, and certainly a concept that I continue to think about when I'm working with clients.
Yeah, I love that you shared that, and so do Peter and Vicky in the chat, who both are sharing some positive responses to
Thumbs up.
the trajectory of your thinking on this. And I know
Okay,
it's
cool.
a developing thinking, but I think one theme, first of all, that certainly falls under active, versus passive, and you can probably think of it from that perspective. But um, the path to, yes, have an edge, it's a behavior, it's a way of being. But if you think about, okay, you've constructed a team with people, who want to do great things, and right, who want to be challenged and engaged, right? Tension can feel uncomfortable, but when done properly, again, I think the emotional descriptions of what it might feel like to be in that environment are: I'm excited, right? I'm engaged, I'm passionate, right? I'm active, right? As somebody who's experiencing that. And if I'm not, I'm bored, I'm apathetic, right? I'm feeling disengaged. And maybe, yeah, I'm doing my work, but it's, are we really challenging things? Are we really pushing things forward? And so I think that speaks a lot to the value of what it means to have an edge and create that environment.
Right. Yeah. And as you're talking, I'm just thinking about this idea of like, yeah, it's really uncomfortable, but boy, it's thrilling to be on this journey, going to some exciting place, and there's a bit of risk involved and a bit of danger. And I don't know if we're gonna achieve the goal. Like it's a very aspirational goal. Absolutely. I think there can be something that's really motivating about going into a zone of discomfort. Also, I'll just add that just this morning I heard Walter Isaacson being interviewed on CBC Radio about his new book about where he profiled Elon Musk, And he was basically talking about this exact thing on the radio, is how he perceived that Elon Musk really didn't have the sort of the empathy relational side of things, but he really just wanted to push innovation, and he saw empathy in the relational aspects of leadership as something that held back innovation. And Isaacson's perspective, looking at him from a distance and as an observer, was that no, he might benefit from kind of integrating those sides a little bit more together. And I think that's very similar to some of the concepts that I'm getting at here, is how do you integrate the insatiable drive for performance, or this desire to sort of touch the sun, like how close to the sun can we fly, to really seek the limit of performance, but how do you do that in a very relational way, that preserves all the social cohesion around you?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we got some questions from our audience, and so I want to jump to those. But before I do, I have one more question that I'd love you just to comment on, and for maybe people to take away here. And that question is, because there's so much leadership discourse that's driven by people who've been successful leaders themselves, or leadership gurus, right? That isn't really aligned to when it doesn't really stack up when we test the assumptions against evidence. And so how can leaders better integrate good leadership ideas and practices into their work?
Yeah, so I would say first off here, I think there's lots of different types of knowledge out there that can be valuable to input into a leadership development process, or for leadership practitioners to bring into that process. And so I definitely respect, everybody's different life experiences, and that those diversity of experiences can be valuable for clients. But I think, having said that, I also believe that there is some value in knowing what works based on evidence, and not just say, a single individual's experience or a single practitioner's experience. And so I think the challenge here is, like, if you're interested in evidence, like, how do you pull that into your work? Or how do you source a practitioner that can both access that evidence and also translate it into advice and tools that you can use? I do think that organizational psychologists are well positioned to do that. I think they can access some of that material, or they know where to go to get it. They know how to translate it once they find it. They know how to render those ideas into useful tools. And I've done this actually myself. I've taken some tools from clinical psychology and adapted them to coaching domains. Um, I would say a differentiator about organizational psychologists that I think is important to keep in mind is that, like, they're really fantastic with assessment information. So they can really go in depth on assessments. They can understand which tools to choose. They can put assessment results in context. So they don't say, like, oh yeah, this is, some people might feel like, well, just because they got an assessment report, it's like, chiseled in stone tablets on the top of Mount Sinai or something like that. Like, this is your destiny. Like, organizational psychologists are trained in those tools enough that they can say, yeah, you know what, this is one data point, and here's the strengths and limitations of it, and let's put it in context with other data points, and we can use it to triangulate, on themes, etc. So those are, I would say, advice, if you're interested in evidence-based solutions, is hire a highly skilled practitioner. I think organizational psychologists fit that. They're probably not the only people, but certainly they bring some advantages to the table.
Yeah, I agree completely. CSIOP agrees with you. PSYOP agrees with you. But yeah, I'd say again, yeah, to build off of that, if you don't have access to that body of knowledge, or to practitioners that have access to it, there's definitely places you can look. Start with Tim, start with me, follow CSIOP, PSYOP, and other organizations that are promoting those types of ideas as well. Okay, so we've got a couple of minutes left, and so I just wanted to share a couple of questions that came out from our discussion. Okay, so Niati asks, she asks, what are some of the ways you can lead a group that is older than you, based on, in comparison to age? Says sometimes age can affect leadership in a negative way, especially if you're young. How would you deal with this?
Okay, so I guess a couple of things that I would think about are number one, establishing credibility. Are there ways that you can, I don't know if, sorry, what the name was?
Niati?
Niati. So I don't know if Niati, maybe you have some great credentials or some great experience, and the team just doesn't know about it. So sometimes, like, if there's some sort of asymmetry in what you know versus what they know, like, maybe try to even that out and let them know that you have what it takes to lead them. I would say relationship building, relationship building. Whatever you can do to spend time with those people, get to know them, get to know their families' names, build trust and connection with them. That will, I think, have a massive impact on their ability to kind of accept your suggestions and guidance. I think also probably you would need to pretend that those people are almost like a level above you. And so if you were trying to influence somebody at a level above you, you would probably like tone down the directiveness behaviors, and you might tone up or increase the volume on the warmth behaviors, right? Like being very warm, very affiliative, very gently asking questions as opposed to asking really pointed questions or interrupting people. So I think those would be the types of things that you would do if you're influencing somebody at a more senior level, right? But you may want to kind of consider some of these people in that vein, at least until you build up enough relationship strength and credibility with them that you can just sort of forget about that and kind of go, speak and communicate as you normally would. So those are just a few thoughts that come to my mind.
Nice, thank you. And question from Trevor is that he asks, to what degree do you think that bad or passive leaders can be developed into great or active leaders? And is there a point where leadership development is not worthwhile?
Yeah, this is a good question. So my first response is that yes, people can be trained to change their leadership behaviors. I really believe that, and maybe I'm biased and self-serving because I work in the space, but I think if people have a strong reason to change, they can change. I mean, to be a better coach, I read books on like from written by people who counsel folks with like addiction problems, and how do you get somebody who's addicted to alcohol or some other kind of drug, how do you get them to change their behavior? Sometimes if you can convince someone that change is somehow linked to a deep value of theirs or something they really, really value, you can get them to do all kinds of things, right? And go through all kinds of discomfort. So I really truly believe that if people can find a why or find a reason to change or link the change to their deeper values, they can do that. The other thing I would say is I kind of see like passive and avoidant leadership is almost like the junk food in your diet. And like, so maybe with enough discipline, like, can you just cut out the junk food, right? Can you just consciously push yourself with a few goals and maybe some support from a coach or from your boss to engage in a few more proactive behaviors and just kind of inch yourself along? Like, I think teaching somebody to be charismatic might be a bit more tricky, but teaching somebody to just be available and present, like, can we just do that with a bit of focus and a bit of support, create a support system around this person? So anyway, I hope that's helpful. I believe that change for people is possible given finding the right levers, and I think especially change in terms of eliminating passive and avoidant behaviors is probably more straightforward than trying to teach somebody a more complex leadership repertoire, like being an inspirational visionary, for example.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, thank you, Tim. And thank you to everybody who joined today. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your engagement. It was wonderful having you and having this conversation about a topic that we're both passionate about and interested in. And I love hearing about your approach, your thinking on different topics. And I think where people can also benefit is just, in how you are taking an approach that, yes, you have a theory, you have an assumption, but you're asking questions and you're sort of patiently developing your philosophy and your thinking around it. And so I appreciate that. And so I encourage everybody, again, thank you for joining. Please connect with Tim on LinkedIn. Look in the chat where I've put Tim's information, and follow along as he continues to share his leadership philosophies. And please connect with me. Please follow CSIP, which is the Canadian Society for Industrial Organizational Psychologists. Follow on LinkedIn. Stay up to date on future Practice Makes Perfect discussions. I would love to hear from you. Tim would love to hear from you about what you thought, any reflections that you have, any questions that you have. This is also my first time doing an event in this format, and so I'd love to hear what you thought about it and if you have any feedback. So thank you, and Tim, thank you for being a guinea pig on that. So hopefully everything came through clearly. So thank you again, and with that, we're going to say have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Hey, Michael, you still there?
I'm still here. I've ended the stream, but I'd say, why don't I call you back just in case for some
Sure.
reason it's still going on? Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Good idea.